Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the secret history of computer music. It's the story of how these machines, which started out as giant room-sized calculators, actually learned how to sing.
So, really, how do you teach a machine to sing? Back in the 1950s, this wasn't just a technical problem. It was an almost absurd idea. Computers were for crunching numbers, not for composing concertos. And that very question, that challenge, is really the central conflict of our entire story. Okay, so let's just dive right in. The first problem they faced was about as fundamental as it gets. How do you even get a computer, a machine that's built for pure, cold logic, to make any kind of sound at all?
Well, the first big breakthroughs happened right here with a guy named Max Matthews at the legendary Bell Telephone Laboratories. He and his team developed the world's very first music software, and they gave it a pretty simple name, Music I. What they did was, they basically turned a room-sized IBM computer into the world's most primitive and probably the most expensive musical instrument. Now, Matthews' big aha moment, his key insight, was creating these things he called unit generators. The best way to think of these is like digital Lego bricks for sound. Each one was a fundamental building block, a little piece of code that could create a simple wave or filter a sound. A composer could then pick and choose these blocks to build a totally new digital instrument, completely from scratch.
And this whole system, which became known as the music end paradigm, really cleverly mirrored the way traditional music works. You had an orchestra file, and that's where you defined your digital instruments built from those Lego bricks. And then you had a score file, which was just a list of instructions telling those instruments what to play, when to start, how long to hold the note, and so on. It was like a digital symphony, all laid out in lines of code.
But, solving one problem created a new, much more subtle one. The first computer sounds were, they were really simple, just pure tones. They didn't have that rich, complex quality of a real acoustic instrument, that unique character we call timbre. So the question became, how could they create that richness efficiently, without totally overwhelming the super primitive computers of the day?
The big breakthrough for this problem came from John Chowing over at Stanford University. And get this. While he was just experimenting with creating a simple vibrato effect, he accidentally stumbled upon an incredibly efficient method for creating really complex sounds. It's called frequency modulation synthesis, or just FM synthesis for short.
The process itself is almost magical because it's so simple. So it starts with a pure, simple sound wave, and we call that the carrier. Then you take a second, totally silent wave, the modulator, and you use it to rapidly wobble the frequency of that carrier. The result of that interaction? A completely new, incredibly complex timbre just bursting with rich harmonic details that weren't in either of the original waves.
So the really crucial point is what Chowning himself said. He could control a large timbral space within a small parameter space. So what on earth does that mean? It means with just a few simple knobs to turn, he could generate this huge variety of complex, bell-like metallic sounds. And for those early computers that had next to no processing power, that kind of efficiency was an absolute game changer.
All right, let's move on to the next major hurdle. Because even with these incredible advances in creating sound, the actual process of composing music was painfully slow. A composer would write their code, feed it to the giant mainframe computer, and then just wait. Sometimes for hours, sometimes even for days, before they could hear a single note of what they'd written. The problem, at its core, was the complete lack of real-time feedback. Composing was this one-way street of submitting code and then hoping for the best. The dream, the goal, was to turn this into a real interactive dialogue where a musician could play something and the computer would respond instantly, like a real musical partner.
And the solution to this problem really started to take shape at IRCAM, the legendary Music and Acoustics Institute in Paris. And it came largely through the work of a composer named Philippe Minori, whose pieces were constantly pushing the absolute limits of what was possible in a live performance with a computer.
Minori's work, which he did in collaboration with a developer named Miller Puckett, introduced this revolutionary idea called the score follower. So here's how it worked. You'd have a pianist playing on a piano that was equipped with MIDI. The computer would literally listen to that MIDI data coming in. Then it would match the notes the human was playing to a digital score it had in its memory, and it would trigger all these pre-programmed electronic sounds in perfect sync. The computer was no longer just a playback machine. It had finally joined the band. It was a live, interactive partner. So when you get this convergence of ideas, really complex synthesis, and true real-time interaction, it leads to this profound philosophical shift. The computer wasn't just imitating instruments anymore.
It was becoming a tool for composing with the very fabric of sound itself. And a really key technique here is something called granular synthesis, which was pioneered by composer Barry Truax. So instead of thinking in terms of notes and chords, this technique builds these vast soundscapes from thousands and thousands of tiny little sonic grains, each one lasting just a few milliseconds. It's really like painting with pixels, but for sound.
You can really hear this in his landmark 1986 piece, River Run. In it, Truax uses real-time granular synthesis to create these immense, evolving clouds of sound, all from really simple starting points. He could shape and control thousands of these tiny audio events all at once, creating these massive soundscapes that felt alive, like they were constantly shifting and changing.
And taking this whole idea of composing with a sound's DNA even further is a technique called spectral morphing. This was pretty much perfected by a composer named Trevor Wishart. And honestly, the ultimate, almost unbelievable example of this is Wishart's 25-minute piece called Imago. Every single sound you hear in that entire piece was grown from one single source, the sound of two whiskey glasses clinking together. That's it. By analyzing the frequency DNA of that one tiny clink, he was able to morph and grow an entire epic world of sound. It's basically sonic alchemy.
So, why does any of this pioneering, sometimes really academic work actually matter today? Let's take a quick look at the legacy that these people built.
Well, the progression over the decades is it's so clear and powerful. It starts with those first academic experiments at Bell Labs in the 50s. That evolves to the timbral revolution of FM synthesis in the 70s. And that leads to the dawn of real-time performance in the 80s. And today, these pioneering concepts are absolutely everywhere. They're inside our phones, they're in our laptops, they're in the synthesizers you hear in pop music, and they're all over the scores of Hollywood films.
Think about it. From room-sized calculators to the pocket-sized studios that we all carry around with us today, this journey has fundamentally reshaped not just how we make music, but what music can be. These innovators didn't just invent new technology. They invented entirely new ways of thinking about and composing with sound itself.
And that leaves us with one last pretty provocative thought. For decades, we were teaching machines how to imitate our sounds. But now that machines can create entirely new sonic universes from scratch, what new music will we choose to create with them? As this relationship between human creativity and machine intelligence gets deeper, you have to believe the next great sonic revolution is out there, just waiting to be composed.